Institute for Human Development. He was a former professor of Center for the Study for Regional Development in the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. So we would like to hear from Professor Ravi Srivastava. What does this budget have in store for workers, especially the informal sector workers who form the vast majority of the workforce of our country? So without much ado, I invite Professor Ravi Srivastava to speak.
Thank you, Sushovan. So, yeah, what I am going to do is to really focus on, give you some comments on a budget from a very labor-centric perspective, right? I think everybody here who's on board just now would have heard many commentaries on the budget, but they're not essentially from a labor-centric perspective. And I'm glad that you brought us together to discuss it from that point of view. Now, let me just, I think, again, everyone in labor line is familiar with labor issues, but still, let me just lay out the broad context for you. We roughly have an estimated workforce of about 55 crores, 550 million workers in India. Now, the notion of work is defined in a particular way, and there is a debate that it doesn't measure women's work, particularly measure women's unpaid work particularly well, and that is a point which is very well taken. But nonetheless, however it is measured, we have that workforce is roughly about 55 crores currently. Now, I'll go, if there is time, I'll go into how this workforce seems to have expanded from about 51 crores to 55 crores during the COVID period, as per the government estimates. But for the time being, let me confine myself to saying that what does this workforce consist of? These 55 crore workers. So let's just sort of look at how this pyramid of workers is stacked to begin with, and I'll give maybe a couple of perspectives on it. So if you look at, imagine the workforce consisting of a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid are some highly skilled workers. These highly skilled workers are basically workers who use their cognitive skills, administrative skills, and managerial skills. And they are regarded, therefore, as being highly skilled, and they currently form around 13 to 15% of the workforce, right? At the bottom are the workers who are what are described in as elementary occupations. Elementary occupations require a rudimentary form of skills, and these form about 30 to 35% of the workers. Another 30-35% of the workers who are above them are slightly more skilled. They could be workers who are working in the industrial workforce, or they could be workers who are working in the agricultural workforce. So roughly about 70% of these workers, 35% workers who are in elementary occupations, another 30-35% who have somewhat more skills, and these include the agricultural cultivators and other categories of industrial workers. And then we have workers with the middle level of skills, basically clerical workers, sales workers, etc. Right. So this is broadly what the entire composition of the workforce looks like. Now, when we look at it from a labor perspective, this is basically the perspective of a workforce, and this workforce includes everyone who is notionally described as a worker. We normally do make a distinction between workers who derive their remuneration from the work that they do, from the labor that they put in, and we differentiate this from workers who derive their remuneration from let's say supervisory roles, managerial roles, other administrative roles, and even high level of cognitive roles, where in a sense they partake also to a certain extent from not only from the labor that they put in, but also from the share, as it were, in the share in the profits of capital, right? And they contribute to the profit of capital directly. Okay, so these are workers who, well, you can define them as workers. They are there, but in the sense, they are the workers who, part of their returns come from profits and not necessarily from the work that they do. Now, this is one way of stacking labor. The other way of stacking labor isn't in terms of, there was a note which you had put out, it is in terms of informality. A large percentage of our Indian workforce consists of workers who have no job security and no social security. Okay. Now, these workers broadly, roughly about 91 to 92% of workers don't enjoy any job security. And roughly about 10% of the workers only have access to any form of employer-provided social security, right? So the rest of them are informal workers. Now, the informal workers being 90% of the workforce are also obviously many layered. They're very heterogeneous. There is a small percentage of informal workers who consist of self-employed professionals and who do high-value work and they derive relatively high incomes. The other informal workers are also in very different categories. Some of them do petty work. They are self-employed. Some of them do putting out work. Then there are casual workers. There are workers working with contractors. There are workers working with, doing some kind of regular work with or without any job security. So the 90% workforce is, of course, a huge number, and they are multi-layered. They're also very heterogeneous, right? Now, when we look at labor and we want to see what a budget may do to labor, I think there are two broad parameters, or let's say benchmarks, which we can do we can use in order to see where did the budget stand in terms of labor. One is that we would like, because we know that in a country like India, there is a great deal of underemployment and there's a great deal of unemployment. And of course, during the COVID years, unemployment had increased a great deal, underemployment had increased a great deal. A lot of people were doing work which they would not have done earlier in the non-COVID periods. A large number of people returned from urban areas to rural areas, and they were eking out an existence from various kinds of, petty work in agriculture or for Manrega, etc. So the one thing we would like any budget to do is to expand the scope of demand and employment for them. So basically, if the demand for workers increases, this will tend to increase employment. And if employment of workers, in general, the employment of workers increase, it is likely, it is not necessary, it is not essential. It is likely that they may be able to, that their living conditions may improve because, first of all, they will get more work days in a year. Secondly, they may also be able to bargain for better wages if there is higher demand for work. So one essential criteria of looking at a budget is whether it will increase the demand for workers, whether it will expand employment. The other broad criteria, and I say broad because this has several elements in it, is that what we would like to do, have to happen is that the workers in an economy should have what the commission of which I was a part, the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, which looked very closely at unorganized workers, said at one point of time that we would like the workers, all workers in our economy, to have what we call the social floor. What is a social floor? The social floor consists of three broad things. One, it consists of minimum conditions of work. And these minimum conditions of work includes, for example, an 8-hour working day, minimum wages. Broadly, however minimum wages are defined, because there is obviously a debate on how high or how low or where the minimum wages should be pitched. They should get due remuneration for their work under proper conditions. Their rights at work should be respected. That's another part of the social floor. And also the social floor should constitute the basic necessities of life. So the basic necessities of life, which are generally acquired through public provisioning. For example, the children being able to get education, the right to shelter, basic health, etc. The economy should be in a position to provide that. Finally, because workers fall into good times and bad times, at the end of their working period, they retire. Sometimes they meet with accidents. Women have maternity episodes, or there are periods when they have to withdraw from the workforce. Workers should be entitled to a minimum level of social security. So social floor consists of three things: minimum working conditions, access to a bundle of goods which are socially necessary, such as education, health, and so on, and thirdly, social security. So broadly, when we look at a budget or when I would look at a budget from a labor-centric perspective, I would actually look at these two components. Has the budget enough wherewithal to expand the demand for labor? And secondly, does it have elements in it which will increase, or at least if not provide, but at least work towards improving the social floor for workers in the three senses that I have talked about. Okay. Now, if you look at the current budget, what the current budget says, and I'm going to be very brief here, the current budget, you must have listened to debates. The current budget, assumption of the current budget, the assumption of the economic survey is, number one, that the economy has revived. It has revived in unemployment terms to the pre-COVID levels. So basically, it actually wishes away the problem of underemployment and unemployment by saying that we are on a path of steady recovery. In the economic terms also, the budget makes the point that it is a post-recovery budget. So the scars of COVID are no longer with us. It takes the view that in order to accelerate growth, the economy or the government should spend a relatively greater proportion of its budget on capital goods. Capital goods are goods which increase the productive capacity of the economy. If there are any questions in terms of language, or if I'm not making myself understood, Sushobhan, please do tell me, and I'll be willing to also maybe speak in a more mixed language, English or Hindi, or at least again simplify whatever I'm saying.
Sure, sir. No problem.
If there is anything of the kind, do tell me. So essentially, the one of the highlights of the budget, as pointed out by the finance minister, is that it has invested really nearly 10 lakh crores is been budgeted for capital expenditure. And it also makes the point that if you include the fact that it is willing to give additional borrowing to the states for capital expenditure, then the finance minister points out that this increases to 13.5 lakh crores. So roughly 3.9% is what the finance minister says of GDP is what the finance minister says that she has committed to capital expenditure. Now, why is this important, and why is this, or let me say, why is this potentially important? The reason why this is potentially important is because those among you who are possibly economists or have some understanding of economic processes is because in the 1920s and 1930s, the economist Keynes said that when governments spend on investment, public expenditure, this has a multiplier effect on the economy. And what he meant was that if the government does one round of investment in the economy, it will generate some amount of employment, some amount of incomes, and that additional income which is generated will then create the scope for more expansion of demand and more jobs and more incomes. And ultimately, if the government spends, let's say, X rupees on public investment, then it will not only will that immediately increase income by X rupees, but in the long run, investment will increase by 3x and employment commensurately will also increase. Okay, so basically the argument is that government expenditure has what is known as a multiplier effect on the economy. In the present context, the government also believes that when it spends more on roads, on logistics, on railways, etc., it will facilitate private investment. Private investment in this country has been languishing for the past 7-8 years. The rate of capital formation has been low. So the logic of the government is in essentially, and this is a bit strange, because actually, the government has been, this government in particular, but governments in the past, including the UPA government, has been essentially following a neoliberal path of development. But the logic of the present government is essentially Keynesian, that if we invest more, then we would create more jobs in the long run and in the short run. And these jobs will be created not only through government investment, but also through higher amounts of private investment, right? So the question then arises is, that's one part of the, let's say, the basics of the budget. The second part is that the government has spent, has emphasized the path of green energy transition. So, green hydrogen, low carbon emissions, and so on and so forth. This also has been emphasized, and some amount of investment has also gone into the creation of green energy. And once again, the direct investments are not so high, but the government believes that the indirect investments which will be forthcoming for the private sector would make the path of green transition very viable. Okay. Now, I'm going to first, these are two very central features of the budget. So I'll talk a little bit about them and then I'll go on to the rest. As I said, I laid down some benchmarks at the beginning of the lecture. So I'll talk about those benchmarks. So first of all, there is a great deal of cynicism, number one, on whether the government figures, when it says that it will be roughly spending 10 lakh crores on capital expenditure, whether, and 13.3 lakhs overall, whether these are credible figures. And Ratin Roy, in a recent article in Business Standard, argued that actually the government's, the public sectors, if you include the public sector and government together, then the capex, the capital expenditure, was not really going to rise. Others have made the argument that while this is indicative of, let's say, an intention on the part of the government, there is no way that the government will be able to spend this kind of money on a shelf of projects within the scope of a year. There is another strand of argument which I believe is far more important, and which is that most of the government's investments, except for a very small fraction, which is on urban housing, the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, but this is also under what is known as the credit-linked subsidy scheme. The bulk of investment is in fairly capital-intensive projects, ports, railways, logistics, highways, etc. The argument is that even if government manages to spend all this, first of all, it will not create too many jobs. It will create very little jobs. Secondly, the jobs that will be created down the line will be of a far more skill-intensive character. So in other words, the expansion of jobs at the bottom of the pyramid, which is what I talked about, is not going to be very large, even if the capex expenditure were to increase as the government proposes to increase it. So in other words, this strategy of putting more money in capex, many people have argued, is really first of all, it is not it is not something which is probably will going to be implemented in the short run. Secondly, the multiplier effects or the employer effects of this strategy are going to be relatively small. Thirdly, the employment that is going to be generated is not going to be for the bottom 50% or 60% or 70% of the workforce. So the small additional amounts of employment which will be generated are more likely to be more skill intensive. Okay, so these are the three basic limitations of the strategy. Now, in order to make this strategy, remember this strategy is being worked in a context where the government has tried to pull back overall levels of expenditure. So it is the fiscal deficit will contract from 6.4%. The budgeted fiscal deficit will contract from what it was in the last year, 6.4% to 5.9%. In order to do that, the government has naturally contracted, not in absolute terms, but the expansion in overall levels of expenditure has been kept low. And within that overall expansion in the levels of expenditure, since capex has been favored, then naturally the other items of expenditure have contracted. And let me now look at the elements of expenditure which have been contracted and what that means in terms of the elements of the social floor that I have talked about. So the most visible item where contraction has happened is Social Security. There was some anticipation, when the eShram portal was launched and the government seemed to be seized with the migration crisis. There seemed to be some anticipation that the government may invest more on Social Security, particularly in view of the fact that there's a forthcoming poll coming up in 2024. That actually has not happened. Social Security expenditure has contracted in real terms. First, let me look at, we can look at all elements of Social Security expenditure. Let me begin by looking at old age pensions. The government has the Social Assistance Program, under which it gives old age pensions to poor people at an abysmal rate of 300 rupees per year, which is absolutely meaningless, which is roughly about, the average daily wage of a casual worker, a casual worker in a year. Now, the nominal budget means budget in money terms, has been roughly kept constant between 2022 and 23-24, which means that in real terms, the outlay on NSA and the National Social Assistance has declined. The government launched with great fanfare some of the pension schemes in the last few years. These were the Atal Pension Yojana. Then there were specific schemes which were launched for unorganized workers, for and for traders and so on. The government's outlay, the government's provisioning for each of these pension schemes has declined quite significantly. Okay, so as far as pensions are concerned, the government's outlay has declined. Whether you look at the contributory pension schemes such as the Atal Pension Yojana, or whether you look at a non-contributory pension scheme such as the old National Social, which comes under the rubric of the National Social Assistance Program. So the one element of social floor, it is quite clear. This is old age pensions. There is, of course, nothing in the budget for any other element of Social Security, whether it is accidents or whether any of this. I will deal with health a little differently, but there is nothing in the budget for any of this. Now, the other element of one element of Social Security and one element also of the kind of essential goods which constitute the social floor, and this is part of the Social Protection Floor Initiative of the UN, is also access to health services. Now, there is again, except the government outlay on health has remained nearly constant, and I think one needs to make a caveat here. The bulk of the health expenditure in India on health as well as in education actually comes from the states. But nonetheless, the center has an extremely important role in catalyzing health expenditure. And over the years, this role has expanded because of many vertical programs, such as the National Health Mission. In recent years, there was also one very large component, an important component of health programs which has come up, which is basically the insurance program, the health insurance programs which the government has launched. Now, if you look at the total allocation, the National Health Mission allocations have not increased. Just about 6,000 crores, a little over 6,000 crores has been allocated to the Ayushman Yojana. So there is no increase in allocation. And this is, by the way, these 6,000 crores is expected to take care of 50 crore workers and their families in India. So you can imagine that it's really a pittance, and it can only work if workers don't actually go across and use the Ayushman Yojana to any extent. So again, as far as health is concerned, and particularly these two elements, the National Health Mission and the Ayushman Yojana is concerned, we do not find any significant outlay increases. Again, as far as education is concerned, there are small increases in, for example, residential schools for tribal children and so on. But overall, the percentage allocation on education as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of revenue expenditure has, in fact, is slightly lower in 23-24 than in 22-23. So if you look at education, if you look at health, if you look at social security, you find that the picture is actually extremely disconcerting, and the government outlays have declined. On Manrega, I think all of you would be aware of the fact that the government has decreased its outlay by nearly 50%. From, it was the actual revised expenditure was 89,000 something crores in 22-23, and the government has only allocated about 60,000 crores, out of which 10 to 15,000 crores will go in for wage areas. So there is very little which remains for fresh jobs. Now, Manrega has been an extremely important fallback scheme, and it proved its worth. We all remember the famous words of the Prime Minister after he took over the reins of power in 2014, and he said, "My government will not bolster programs where people are digging up holes," and so on. But during his own regime, it has been shown that Manrega has had an enormous utility, and particularly, of course, in COVID years, we have seen that. In fact, the government itself, the Manrega is not about digging holes and filling them up. Contrary to what mainstream economists would also like to believe, Manrega is essentially a capital expenditure scheme. It is a scheme which creates capital assets in rural areas. It improves rural connectivity. It has helped to create rain harvesting structures, ponds, wells, and so on. So it creates assets, and these assets, which are created with very low amount of funds, have a fairly significant impact. And over the last few years, a lot of Manrega funds have been going into improving productivity on individual lands of marginal farmers and small farmers. So basically, Manrega contributes directly to the productive capacity in rural areas, and that is the unique feature about Manrega, that it is designed to be demand oriented, and that it creates capital assets of high value not in terms of the amount of money spent in large projects, but high value in terms of their significance to the rural population. And therefore, it is not at all a dole. The impression is created that it is a dole. People do hard work, they create assets, and these assets increase productivity. But what governments have tended to do for a long period of time, and this, by the way, doesn't go back only to the present government. The previous government, when the finance minister was Mr. Chidambaram, started scaling back the budget on Manrega from about 2012-13 onwards, and also squeezing the wages in Manrega. So Manrega wages, there have been 3 committees. All 3 committees have recommended that Manrega wages should be a subsistence level. The government has resisted the recommendation of these committees. And at the same time, it has squeezed funds for Manrega. Now, many people are, the government argument is, look, it's a demand-oriented scheme. So if people want more work, then we'll allocate more to Manrega. But that's not the way it works, because actually Manrega could never become a totally demand-oriented scheme. It's a scheme which basically people, which governments provide specific amounts of funds, and the labor plans which are made and submitted to government are cut back according to the funds which are allocated. Therefore, it's a tightly rationed scheme. And it is rationed so heavily that many of you would know that people who are unemployed and seek work, actually their applications are not registered. So the demand for work is never truly registered. But surveys point out that almost 20 to 30%, even in normal years, 28 to 30% of the demand for Manrega is unmet demand. So basically, cutting back on Manrega is really cutting back on crucial infrastructure creation, but it also cutting back on a very important fallback, which people have in rural areas for generating a minimum level of income for themselves and for making ends meet. So from all these perspectives, if one looks at the budget is not one which aims at providing, whether one looks at social security angle, whether it looks at whether the budget can provide a social floor in terms of basic health, basic education, basic amenities, the budget falls below benchmarks. There are one or two specific heads in which the budget, let's say, scores a point. First of all, an substantial additional amount has been allocated to urban housing, but this, as I pointed out, is really in a credit cum subsidy linked scheme. So it's basically its success will depend on whether people also there's an uptake for credit for urban housing among lower income households. And the other part is that so the capex, the capex amount that I talked about earlier, the capital expenditure amount that I talked about earlier, includes this additional allocation of about 60,000 crores for urban housing. So this is one area in which one can say that the government has tried to create jobs which have a low gestation period, and where these jobs can be both not only of high scale but of low scale. Other than that, most of for example, the government since 2007-8, successive governments have talked a great deal about skilling. And the government in this budget also has, with great fanfare, launched the fourth version of the PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana, PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0. What it has done is it has rejigged the earlier PMKVY without increasing the budget by even an iota of rupees, under some fancy names, tribe, this, other, and a lot of skill creation is sought to be, the impression is being created that a lot of this skill would be for industry 4.0 technologies, for robotics, for coding, for artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. But there is no assessment on why India needed a PMKVY 4.0. Again, the only additional point here, which again points to the failure of additional schemes, because the government had launched the earlier apprenticeship scheme with great fanfare. Now what it has said is that over the next 3 years, it will provide stipends to apprentices, 47 lakh apprentices, in other words, about 15 lakh a year, we provided stipends by the government to take up apprentice schemes. So this again, in a sense, is acknowledges the failure of the apprenticeship schemes, because this means that the industry is not willing to take on apprentices by paying them even a minimum level of a minimum support level. Okay, so broadly, this budget is not a budget which is aimed at the bottom 60 to 70% of the population. Another marked reduction in outlay is that of agriculture. There is less outlay now for the National Agricultural Development Program, less outlay for irrigation, less outlay for the crop insurance program. An accelerator fund has been set up in which an outlay has been made. That accelerator fund is to promote startups in agriculture. So basically, it is not to increase the directly increase the income of cultivators. And we know the background of the agrarian crisis that we've been having, and the difficulties which farmers have had, which led to the farmers' movement, and so on. But the government really, in a sense, has gone back, and it has reduced the degree of support to agriculture. For MSMEs, which is another important sector where employment could be generated, apart from the credit-linked subsidy scheme, there is absolutely nothing in it. So there is no focus on medium and small scale industries. Medium and small scale industries are now very wide rubric in any case, because any industry which has an investment up to 50 crores or a turnover up to 250 crores comes under this rubric of MSME. And in the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, we had argued that the focus should really be on micro and informal sector industries, because these form almost 98 to 99% of all small units, and the credit and other support to them had been declining over the years. So let me summarize basically, in my view, what this budget does. This budget accentuates the trends which have been in the economy for the last several years. What are these trends? These trends are to essentially push growth towards the higher segment of the economy, push growth to the more capital intensive segments, push growth to the upper end of the formal sector, organized sector, thereby increasing the inequality which has come to prevail. Inequality has been increasing, inequality in wealth, in assets and income has been increasing in the economy for a long time to come. The measures that it has taken to create a social floor, except for the fact that the NFSA scheme now, because thanks to the impending election in 2024, there is a provision of grain for free, and hopefully it will last till the elections, so people will not have to pay 2 rupees and 3 rupees, which was a nominal sum for the grains that they receive under the NFSA. There is actually no other significant step has been taken to alleviate the distress and the suffering which we have been seeing over many years. The point, I also need to make the point at the end that the distress and the suffering is an endemic distress and suffering. Unemployment and underemployment in the Indian economy has been growing. For a long period of time, the Indian economy has been generating less jobs than the growth in the labor supply. Okay, and this increased in the decade or a couple of decades before COVID. So this was not a COVID phenomenon. The COVID brought additional distress. It brought additional distress on the informal sector, on the laboring masses, and so on. The data that we have, the official data, the PLFS we have, unfortunately, it seems to me is becoming a less and less credible source of information. There is a serious data crisis in this country, which we as people who have broader concerns should be trying to address, maybe by collecting our own data at different levels. So the data collected by the government agencies no longer reflect the endemic crisis in the economy. The signals which go out to the government on which they should make policies not strong enough. In any case, the government own narrative is one where it was a very sanguine narrative, where it believes that the unemployment problem has largely been taken care of. Formal employment is growing, the formal sector is growing. Therefore, basically, the government believes it is on the right lines. So the story of distress and unemployment and underemployment, which needs to be addressed by the budget, we should have invested more in the social floor, and where even small amounts of investment in the quality of employment, let us say in the safety of workers, would have made a lot of difference to the workforce, have not been carried out. So in a sense, I must point out, of course, that this is not the only budget which has gone in this direction. But given that this budget is taking place in the post-COVID context, and it is taking place after several years of severe crisis in the economy for the informal sector and for workers in general, it is quite amazing that the budget is so sensitive to the social and economic reality around it. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Professor Srivastava, for actually highlighting the key takeaways from the budget, which is none for the labor sector. It's very important for us who are engaged in some form or the other in different capacities in the labor sector to take note that the budget has failed to address either the question of employment or the question of social flow, and also what it has done as far as NRHA and other things are concerned will cause a series of rural distress as well as urban distress. We would be happy to open the floor for questions. I would request everyone, whoever wants to come with their question, to be brief so we have more time for discussions. So the floor is open. Please put your hands up. Anybody with questions?
There is one comment by Geeta Menon. I would like her to, in the chat box, but I would like her to invite and speak.
Yeah, can you please read it out? I mean,
Geeta ji, is it okay if I speak, or would you like to say? Okay, I will read it out. Thanks for clarity, Professor Ravi. Data crisis continues to elude the larger crisis, diverts attention. Have a clarification in the context of the debt crisis as a whole, and allocation, defense versus social security, what the future going to be?
Okay. Yeah, so what is the future going to be? In my view, the path taken by successive governments in India is to set us on a path of an unsustainable and iniquitous growth. Okay, it's unsustainable because at the moment, in the context of the global crisis and in the context that we face in India, growth should be based on domestic demand, which is generated at the bottom of the pyramid, let's say by 60, putting more money through employment, not only through any social security, but through employment and wages into the hands of the laboring people in this country. If you don't do that, then you tend to rely more and more on external markets, or you tend to rely more and more on a very narrow segment of the Indian market, which requires capital intensive goods, which requires white goods and so on. And if you do that, then the capital intensity will rise further, the potential for creating jobs will increase, and this will make growth further unsustainable, and it will also increase the inequalities, which are already very, very high in the Indian economy. So you need a very basic correction in the way you think about the economy today.
Thanks, Professor Ravi, but my question was more related to also the debt crisis that has been there from years, from the beginning of the late 80s, the debt crisis, the international debt crisis. So in the context of that, and whenever a budget is framed, in the context of this debt crisis, the allocations are always in the terms and conditions of the structural adjustment program that has been laid out. So we have seen over the years where defense has been given a larger allocation, and as social security or social spending, of course, has been given less and lesser. So while the debt crisis continues to increase because of our kind of borrowings and kind of expenditure, how do we correct this then? How do we then finally bring it onto a balance mode?
So specifically, the kind of debt that you're talking about, where conditional, where the IMF or the World Bank lays down conditions for structural adjustment. Uh, India was subject to that in the early 90s. But after that, the path of development that we've taken, neoliberal development that we've taken, doesn't really have to do with external debt. It has to do with the way internal priorities have developed in a neoliberal government. So the internal priorities are driving us, and of course there is a global context with the global context of the Washington Consensus, the way credit rating agencies work, and so on and so forth. So governments work in order to attract more investment, not necessarily debt, but more investments from abroad. So it's basically what I'm trying to say is that it's now internalized within the internal logic of the neoliberal path of development that we've taken. It doesn't necessarily arise from conditional debt.
Okay.
The next person, did Kattani Chamaraj, did you raise your hand? Do you want to pose a question?
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I wanted to ask Professor Ravi Srivastava, what will be the impact of this budget on the future of the Social Security Code? Will it ever come into force this year, or will it be left hanging since they have not even brought in the rules yet?
Yeah. So, the Social Security Code, such as it is, has very little to offer to the unorganized sector. Because there are no financial commitment. There was no financial memorandum with the Social Security Code. There are no goalposts which the Social Security Code sets out for creating a universal Social Security architecture over a period of time. So as the Social Security Code stands, it actually has very little promise for the unorganized sector. The promise exists, if at all, in two very tiny slivers. One is that can the EPFO and ESIC expand to sections of the unorganized sector? Now, here there are many issues because the EPFO and the ESIC are contributory in nature. Being contributory in nature, they rest on a structure where employees and employees can both contribute, whereas the bulk of our workforce does not have stable employment contracts and does not even have a recognizable employer. So there are limits to which you can stretch the contributory mode of social insurance in India. So that in my view, let's say, that aspect is closed for us. Although the EPFO and the SIC have been given a mandate to try and expand, I don't think that will go very far. Some horizontal expansion may occur, but beyond that, it is not going to be much. The second scope which exists is industries on which there is a cess. The scope of cess, as you know, has been reduced because of GST. Thanks to the movement of workers, a concerted movement, the cess survived as far as the Building and Construction Workers Act is concerned. That cess survived. So elements of that Welfare Act have been brought into the code. And the second aspect of the cess which has been brought in has been for the gig workers, right? Now, both of them have actually run or face formidable problems of implementation. As far as gig workers is concerned, the employers, the platforms have been putting up a very stiff resistance. The government has not been able to move forward, despite this being, even G20, they are talking about it and the government is, but they have not been able to move forward. In the Building and Construction Workers Act, there are fundamental problems. There are fundamental problems in which you look at it. The building and construction workers are mobile. They're mobile between territories, they're mobile between states, and the Building and Construction Workers Act is essentially, leaves it to state level boards, the kind of benefits and so on. So there is still, this calls for a very extended discussion, but to harmonize the nature of the work process in the construction industry with the way the building and construction workers, the chapter 7 of the code has been visualized, is itself not going to be an easy act to follow in the years to come. So, which is why, as things stand just now, the labor code does not have, the social security code does not have very much to offer to unorganized workers. And if it had anything to offer to the unorganized workers, I believe the 23-24 budget, which is the last pre-election budget, would have introduced some elements of that. The fact that it has not introduced any element of that basically tells us both the limitations of the code and also, of course, the intentions of the government.
Okay, Shweta has a question about municipal bonds. Shweta, would you like to pose the question directly to Professor Srivastava?
Good morning, Professor Srivastava.
Yes,
I actually got the answer in the question which you answered previous to the one that you had answered, saying that the liberalization has become more entrenched and is more visible in the subsequent budgets. It's an impact that we see all through. Yeah.
thanks.
So my question was about the municipal bonds and monetization of land being used as a resource for capital investment. So we have seen these programs earlier also. These are not new, and more and more they are kind of getting entrenched in the way we raise funds. And in this, only the lucrative municipal corporations kind of get the bulk of the investment. The smaller cities, 2-tier, 3-tier cities are always at the non-receiving end of any kind of program, and it creates a mess when similar programs are attempted to be undertaken, because these are also aspirational in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Sushovan, I was answered. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Shushoban, we can't hear you now.
Sorry. Pooja has a question. Pooja Adhikari has a question on MGNREGA. Pooja, would you like to please pose the question directly to Professor Srivastava?
Hi, Professor Srivastava. Thank you so much for the analysis. So I have a question as to what is the alternative for MNREGA that we have, given the fact that it is likely that the government will phase it out in time to come, or has already some plans to phase it out in the time to come. And why I'm saying this, because many times when we are doing advocacy, many times it's important to also propose the alternative which we as civil society might be advocating for. So I would like to know your views about it. Thank you.
I think it should be very clear to all of us, Pooja, that the MNREGA is a fallback program. If there were enough employment opportunities remunerative employment opportunities created in the economy, particularly in the rural sector, people would not fall back upon MNREGA to earn wages which are mostly below the minimum level of wages in the economy. So if you ask for alternatives, the alternative is to basically go in for a labor-intensive strategy of growth, to expand employment, and to exploit employment for both men and women. One of the issues that we are seeing in MNREGA is that since it offers employment for very few days, if and when it does, basically men tend to migrate, and women take up MNREGA work in order to supplement incomes in the household and to combine MNREGA work with other types of domestic work and contributory work, unpaid work. So one needs to also look at the gender dimension of work. If indeed work opportunities were created adequately for both men and women in rural areas, women more because of locational issues, because they are more the way the rural economy works, that there are issues of immobility there. Only a very small proportion of rural households can move to migration destinations bag and baggage. Maybe to brick kilns, to salt pans, and so on and so forth. But otherwise, some people stay back in the villages to look after small plots of land, to look after cattle, to take care of children and so on, because the urban economy also does not have enough to offer to the migrants. So in that context, it is important to look at regeneration of jobs in the rural areas also, not just to look at, one of the stories about jobs is that one should not only be looking at jobs in the aggregate, one should be looking at where jobs need to be generated. And jobs need to be generated in rural areas. Jobs need to be generated in areas where labor supply is still expanding at a faster rate than demand. So in the backward regions of the country. And we, for many years now, we have lost track of any regional development policy. So we're not, the policy that we had earlier of investing more in agriculture in rural areas and in broadly in backward areas, that whole policy framework has been given up and abandoned. Because neoliberal growth demands that you bet on the strong. So you bet on areas which are going stronger, which are closer to the coastal areas, and so on and so forth, which are, which basically readily connect to metropolitan cities and so on.
Thank you, sir.
Any more questions? आप हिंदी में भी सवाल पूछ सकते हैं, बिल्कुल बेशक हिंदी में भी सवाल पूछ सकते हैं. प्रोफेसर श्रीवास्तव हिंदी में ही भी जवाब दे सकते हैं.
Sujata Gotoskar has raised her hand, and there is one more comment by Katyani.
Okay. Sujata, could you pose your question? Is Sujata? Yeah. Hello.
She's not muted, but at the moment, maybe we can move on to the comment by Katyani.
Yeah. So Katyani has a comment saying that.
Yeah, Sujata says they do not seem to hear me. So Sujata, you can put this on the chat box, your question.
Yeah, she has raised her hand once again. Sujata. Okay. Let me put Katyani's question to you, Professor Srivastav. What was the fate of the other SES royalty-oriented schemes for BD workers, cinema workers, mine workers, etc., implemented by the Central Labour Welfare Commissioners? Do they continue outside the Social Security Code?
No. The answer is no. All these SESs, which was the source of the welfare funds, have been subsumed under GST. And as I pointed out, only the construction workers' welfare SES and fund was finally not subsumed under the GST and continues to be retained. There was no reason why it should have been done, but it was done. And the government has been now pushing basically all these strands of workers into the existing government programs, the welfare programs, which we know are in any case very weak in structure. So there is nothing to replace those central welfare funds and SESs.
Okay, Sujata, have you put down your question, or we can move on to the next person?
Sujata ji's question is here. Thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask, the Social Security Code defines wage worker to include domestic work.
No. So let me say the following, that the definition of work in the Social Security Code is relatively broad in some sense, but it is still not broad enough to cover many forms of work, contributory work, other forms of unpaid work, which are fairly significant. And also the Social Security Code ties itself in knots because of various kinds of income ceilings which it puts in various provisions. So for example, each of these, when it talks about self-employed workers, there is an income ceiling. Self-employed workers are only defined with respect to a self-income ceiling. That income ceiling so far is not defined. So basically, the Social Security Code still falls fairly short of having a more universal definition of work. And certainly, the work in domestic households is still a gray area as far as the code is concerned.
Her question had actually two parts, which the second part come much later. So I would read out the second part. Is that, does this anyway reflect in the budget?
Answer to that is, I had already given that answer. There is absolutely no enhancement for any social security measure in the budget. There is a decline in real terms.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from anyone else? Or we are over the...
Veena has put a question.
Okay. Yeah.
Veena Shatrughna has put a question. There was a fear of change in labor laws, which would increase hour of work and much more. Where does it stand?
So basically, yes, the hours of work issue was rolled back, partly rolled back, because after the hue and cry which was raised, and because it violated the Hours of Work Convention, and the DG-ILO wrote to the Government of India pointing that out. So yes, some of this was rolled back earlier, but of course, the many other provisions in the labor code, particularly in the still remain, and we'll have to see once the rules are rolled out. We'll have to see where things stand. The major implication of the labor codes really, the pro-labor implication could have come through the national floor wage. And the government, we know, is dragging its feet on the level of national floor wage. After rejecting the recommendations of the first committee, setting up two subsequent committees which have not been able to make a definite recommendation. On the negative side, the industrial code bill and so on have a lot of restrictions on industrial action, on strikes and on unions, and we'll have to see how that pans out.
Okay, thank you, Professor Srivastava, for explaining the various dimensions of the budget and what is in for what is in for labor and 550 million workers of the country. I think it's well over an hour, and we thank you once again and we hope to have you in future, more webinars, more discussions. And thanks to all the participants, and thanks to all of you who put your questions. I think we will end here.
Thank you. Thanks to you, and thanks to all the participants. Well, let's hope we can work towards a more labor-oriented economy and labor-oriented growth process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.